Good afternoon, everyone. If y'all could go ahead and be seated, maybe go get your friends who are out in the lobby. We're going to start in just a minute. Hey, Mr. List, good to see you. Okay, thanks. Come on in, be seated. I hope you have had a good day and have heard some good talks and got to meet some new people. And so we will just do this all over again tomorrow. But so again, I hope it was a good day for you. So I was going to tell a little story about 2 years ago. I needed to hire someone as an assistant headmaster at Frisco for the middle school and high school. So I interviewed this guy, and he came in and so nice and affable and smart as a whip. And after he left, I called Mike and I said, Mr. Terry, and I said, well, we're definitely going to hire him in leadership, but I think he needs to lead a school. And so Mr. Jason Porch went and opened a school in El Paso, and I actually went to El Paso, spent quite a bit of time there, kind of interviewing them and getting to know. But I wanted to give a shout out because we have people from that little El Paso school here today. So where are the El Paso people? Raise your hands, yay! So thank you so much, and we are so glad. I think a couple of y'all couldn't come, right? Their planes got diverted or canceled last night for that big storm that came through Dallas, but we very excited to hear them. So as you can see on your agenda, Dr. Jessica Hooten-Wilson was supposed to speak this afternoon. However, she is in quarantine with COVID, and she was very, very disappointed and sad to miss it. So I am so grateful to Dr. Andrew Moran, who is from the University of Dallas and has stepped in, and I certainly look forward to hearing from him. Dr. Moran is an associate professor of English at the University of Dallas. He has taught at the university's Rome campus for one program or another for 15 years, and he is currently the director of classical education in Rome, a summer program for teachers of classical schools that will resume in 2022. We actually have some teachers here that have been. I know Zachary Faust, I don't know where he is. Raise your hand if you've been. He said he saw a few students. Oh, there's Zachary. So a few students of his that had been in the program. He is the author of numerous articles on William Shakespeare, as well as on Ben Jonson and Evelyn Waugh, and is currently writing a book on Shakespeare's comedies. I am very, very excited when he told me his title today. I taught literature for a long time to hear. When I heard this title, I was like, this is going to be awesome. Title of his talk is Shakespeare, Education, and the Playful Pursuit of Happiness. I was like, this is going to be great. Dr. Moran's talk is about 45 minutes long, and so after that, he'd love to take some Q&A from you guys. So if that's something you'd like to do, there are microphones up here. We need y'all to come up to the microphone. We have a couple of campuses, Tyler and El Paso, who are watching this remotely, and we need to make sure that they hear the question. So again, feel free when we get to that point to do that. Otherwise, after Dr. Moran finishes, you are free to go. You're probably going to get out of here a little early today since I'm starting this session early. But again, we will see you tomorrow morning. Doors open at 7:45. Please be seated at 8:30. So, Dr. Moran.
I have spent time in a founder's classroom, that of my friend Jenny Fast in Louisville a few years back, when I led classes on Paradise Lost and The Tempest, during which the quality of the conversations delighted me. I'm aware of the noble aspirations and excellence of the Founders Academies, most especially through the graduates I have taught and the teachers I have taught in the Master's in Classical Education program at the University of Dallas. I'm very happy to be here. I want to begin this talk reflecting on the life and career of one of my favorite writers, Shakespeare's friend and rival, Ben Jonson, another poet and playwright. But I want to stress that I am not presenting Jonson as any kind of moral exemplar, and I hope and pray that Founders Academy students do not grow up to be like him. While Jonson in his life and lyrics often was elegant and elevated, morally earnest and spiritually profound, he could also be crude, vituperative, irascible, imprudent. He was twice jailed for making jokes about the reigning English monarch, first making fun of Queen Elizabeth I in a play of which not a single copy still exists. The censors were so intent on snuffing it out. And then making fun of her successor, James, the King of Scotland, who then became also King James I of England. James had brought down from Edinburgh to London his family, courtiers, and favorites, and so Jonson, of course, wrote a comedy which throughout Acts 1 through 5 ceaselessly made fun of Scottish people. But as one critic noted, in his theatrical career, Jonson did accomplish something every other playwright and director has only dreamed of doing. He killed an actor. I should note that the actor who had a criminal record had attacked Jonson, who was exonerated on the grounds of self-defense. Let me tell another story of Jonson killing someone so as to present him as an exemplar, as a model for your students. At the age of 20, after a couple of years as a bricklayer, he joined the English army that was fighting on behalf of Dutch independence against Spain. During a break in the battle, as all the other soldiers of the two armies stood and watched, he and a Spaniard engaged in a single combat, Jonson killing him and then taking the dead man's weapons as his spoils. What inspired the erstwhile bricklayer to do such a thing? Clearly, books 4 and 7 of the Iliad, when the Trojan and Achaean armies call a truce so that first Paris and Menelaus and later Hector and Ajax can go at it mano a mano. The ancients were always in Jonson's head. As an old man, he admitted to a friend that, quote, he has consumed a whole night in bed, looking to his great toe, about which he hath seen Romans and Carthaginians fight in his imagination. A psychologist would diagnose obsessive-compulsive disorder or worse, but what really inflamed Jonson's imagination was the education the penniless boy received, paid for by a benefactor at the Westminster School, still today one of England's premier schools. It's in fact the alma mater of another poor boy who went there on scholarship from an Irish immigrant family, Shane McGowan of the Pogues, if you're aware of them, the fellow with the lovely teeth and the delirium tremens. Jonson expressed his lifelong gratitude for his education at the Westminster School in a poem honoring his teacher, William Camden, a classicist and historian, England's first great antiquarian. Camden, most reverend head, to whom I owe all that I am in arts, all that I know, how nothing's that, to whom my country owes the great renown and name wherewith she goes. Than thee the age sees not that thing more grave, more high, more holy, that she more would crave. What name, what skill, what faith hast thou in things? What sight and searching the most antique springs? What weight and what authority in thy speech? Men scarce can make that doubt, but thou canst teach. Pardon free truth, and let thy modesty, which conquers all, be once o'ercome by thee. Many of thine this better could than I, but for their powers, accept my piety. So Johnson stands as an exemplar for students of gratitude. How wonderful it must have been for Camden to have received that poem from his former student. Johnson also exemplifies the impact that a teacher may have on a student and the transformation that can occur through a classical education. To reflect on that transformation, including the growth in wonder and joy, I'd like to touch on 3 topics, all relating to play and education. First, I want to speak about the education that Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare received in 16th century England, and the relationship between academic rigor and playfulness that fostered their creativity. Second, I will explain how Jonson and Shakespeare were the beneficiaries of an even older tradition of thinking about play, including in education, that comes down from the most important philosophers of the Western tradition. And I will end with a thought about the value of play for today's students and for today's teachers. Neither the poor Jonson nor the middle-class Shakespeare had any formal schooling after age 15 or so. In fact, few of the great English language writers before the 20th century were university educated. There may be something about a university education with its emphasis on scholarly exactitude and correctness that hamstrings the creative spirit. But both Jonson and Shakespeare read everything they could get their hands on for the rest of their lives, most especially classical literature, as the ambitious, rigorous education that they received in childhood imparted to them an intellectual liveliness that endured. A great classical education, as is obvious, is an excellent preparation for taking on adult responsibilities. But it may also shape minds that are creative and playful, minds that then can engage the world with wonder and joy and communicate that wonder and joy to others. There is a fine book on the schools of 16th century England during the Tudor period, the reigning family of the Tudors. This book about the education that shaped Shakespeare and Jonson, entitled The Tudor Play of Mind, in which the author, Joel Altman, stressed the schools' serious purpose, their practicality. Altman notes that the Tudor grammar schools aimed, quote, to produce men of firm moral conviction whose rhetorical skills would equip them for responsible public life. This was an education that aimed to develop the intellectual as well as the moral virtues that we want for all of our students. An inclination to wonder, an ability to see the particular in light of universal principles, an ability to analyze carefully, an ability to speak articulately. This rigorous education, in which boys as young as 6 were set to mastering Latin so that within a few years they would be reading Cicero, Horace, Ovid, and Virgil, was grounded on the principle, according to Altman, that wonder is the source of learning. Altman quotes the 13th century philosopher Albertus Magnus, or Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas' teacher, on the connection between wonder and learning. Wonder is the movement of the man who does not know on his way to finding out, to get at the bottom of that at which he wonders and to determine its cause. Thus, Aristotle shows in that branch of logic which is called poetic that the poet fashions his story for the purpose of exciting wonder, and that the further effect of wonder is to excite inquiry. So, through poetry and narrative, and through an attentiveness to how language, grammar, and argument work, the Tudor schools not only sharpened the intellects of their students, they prepared them to wonder and to play. In fact, what stands out to me about the curriculum is the connection between rigor and play, most especially in these remarkable writing exercises that they had the boys do. You may have come across the term the 5 canons of rhetoric, the 5 categories or principles of rhetoric. And these are the following. So first, invention, right? The ideas, the coming upon ideas and argument. Second, arrangement, the organizing of one's argument. Third, style, the right use of language to make persuasive one's argument. And fourth and fifth, memory and delivery of importance for public speaking. Invention, the first, the discovery of arguments, was considered the most important skill. And so boys were given playful writing exercises to develop it. Their schoolroom work made them inventive and imaginative. So for example, a student might have to write a laus and a vituperatio. That is, first they would praise a subject for its specific virtues, a person, or an animal, or a place, or a plant, or most anything, coming up with explanations for why it deserved praise. And then they would do the reverse, right? And provide reasons why someone or something should be denounced. Or they would be given the destructio and confirmatio exercise. They might take a passage from the very imaginative history of Herodotus, who has been called both the father of history and the father of lies. And first they'd argue why what Herodotus writes can't possibly be true. And then they would provide reasons why, yes, we can believe what Herodotus tells us. Right? And do you see how that kind of exercise is really good for a kind of intellectual flexibility? Right? The danger is it creates sophists, right? But you're learning how to argue both sides of a question. These exercises shaped minds that could, according to Altman, quote, find many things to say about a given subject. These exercises and this result especially appeal to me because I worry that students today are increasingly inarticulate, not only because they lack confidence using their own mother tongue, but also because they just don't have enough to say. That is the plenitude of things, that with most everything under the sun, there is so much to say and think about, escapes them as modern technologies distract them and continually dull their minds. But Tudor education, that is the 16th century English education, cultivated that virtue of inventiveness, of coming up with idea after idea, paying attention to all the details, coming up with a list of explanations. In Ben Jonson's plays, one can find evidence of this in a very silly, comical way. Comedians often take delight in the inventory, the list that goes on and on and on and on, and the fun is how ridiculously long can you make the list. And in Jonson's comedy, The Alchemist, the fool Epicure Mammon, this hedonist devoted to pleasure and money, imagines what he can do with the legendary philosopher's stone, which turns base metals into gold, and which he expects to acquire. After a passage that, in the interest of good taste and propriety, I will not read, in which Mammon goes into some detail about the harem he will assemble, greater than Solomon's. I promise I'm not going to read that one. He imagines and inventories his plates, silverware, and food. My meat shall all come in Indian shells, dishes of agate set in gold and studded with emeralds, sapphires, hyacinths, and rubies. The tongues of carps, dormice, and camel's heels, boiled in the spirit of Sol and dissolved pearl, Apicius's diet against the epilepsy. And I will eat these broths with spoons of amber, headed with diamond and carbuncle. My footboy shall eat pheasants, cavered salmons, knots, godwits, lampreys. I myself will have the beards of barbels served instead of salads, oiled mushrooms, and the swelling, unctuous paps of a fat, pregnant sow, newly cut off, dressed with an exquisite and poignant sauce, for which I'll say unto my cook, there's gold, go forth and be a knight. Johnson's having fun with just coming up with idea after idea here with this foolish character. I find that hyperbolic list almost always funny. And by the way, modern comedians sometimes use it too. I don't know if you know that movie from about 45 years ago now, Mel Brooks's parody Western Blazing Saddles, in which the voluble villain Hedley Lamar rhapsodizes about the cornucopia of criminals he wants to assemble, the mugs, pugs, thugs, vipers, snipers, bushwhackers, hornswogglers, etc., the full list of which my eternal nemesis, good taste, again keeps me from reciting. But the mind shooting off sparks is not just a source of laughs. The playfully inventive mind generating examples can also generate insights and discover new possibilities. Let me offer one more example from the Tudor schools of academic rigor and academic playfulness working in tandem. In my high school English classes, the only figures of speech I remember learning were metaphor, simile, and personification. I'm guessing most of you had a similar experience. The 19th century romantic and utilitarian suspicious of rhetoric had shaped the curriculum. Away with these figures of speech, they are troublesome to manage and have been worn to rags, fulminated the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And I must admit, they are troublesome to keep straight. At the University of Dallas, we require our English majors to memorize and be able to identify 75 figures of speech. And in fact, the students have trouble keeping them straight, and I got to admit, I have problems keeping them straight. They're hard to keep in your head. And yet, Will Shakespeare at his Stratford Grammar School probably learned about twice as many and was required to identify their use in Latin verse. Wow, talk about academic rigor. Obviously, his mastery of figures of speech contributed to his mastery as a poet. But his use of them is much more than ornamental. Figures were, for Shakespeare, a form of thought. I've discovered something that I find remarkably complex and very cool, that in comedy after comedy, Shakespeare repeats a particular figure of speech in order to reflect and provoke deeper thought about the very action of the play. Playing with words becomes a way of paying attention to the world in front of one. There's a play called Measure for Measure, in which the speeches of the main character, the Duke of Vienna, in the opening scene are notoriously difficult to understand. And you'll see scholarly footnotes that say, oh, this must be a corrupted text. This speech doesn't make any sense. The Duke explains that he will have his deputy, Angelo, bear his figure during his absence. He skips town. Angelo repeats that word, figure, and all the while the Duke, like Yoda in the Star Wars movies, is using the figure of speech anastrophe, the inversion of the usual order of words or clauses. Remember how Yoda says things like, Named must your fear be before banish it you can. Right? The very distinctive aspect of Yoda as a character. Well, that's anastrophe, the reversal of words. I think Shakespeare is inviting the careful reader to see, in Measure for Measure, the inversion of the usual order of things in his own country. He's giving us an image of things being turned around, right? Pay attention. What's going on in front of you? Okay, this is the kind of discovery that thrills a Shakespeare scholar and no one else. But the salient point is that from the hard slog of memorization and analysis, there are fruits, minds that grow creative, lively, and inquisitive when the academic environment encourages a spirit of play. Moving on to the second part of my talk, the greatest philosophers, in fact, have long recognized the importance of play, including in education. Plato especially writes about play. Here are two of my favorite passages. The first from a dialogue called The Laws by a character called the Athenian stranger. He says, "Every man and woman should spend life in this way, playing the noblest possible games. One should live out one's days playing at certain games, sacrificing, singing, and dancing, with the result that one can make the gods propitious to oneself and can defend oneself against enemies and be victorious over them in battle." I love that. Play leads to victory. The other passage is shorter, but gets at things very quickly. Quote, "Play and seriousness are sisters." Isn't that great? Play and seriousness are sisters. They're related. Sisters. A relationship Plato especially stresses when writing about education. Young animals, he points out, leap and jump as if they were dancing with pleasure and playing together. That inclination to play in young human animals leads Plato to recognize the power of play, both to distract children from serious things, but also to lead them to serious things. Plato writes that, quote, we should seek to use games as a means of directing tastes and inclinations toward the stations children are themselves to fill when adult. So we may say, in fact, the sum and substance of education is the right training which effectually leads the soul of the child at play onto the love of the calling in which he will have to be perfect when he is a man. Plato's student Aristotle is more suspicious of playing. He tends to think about play and seriousness in opposition to each other. But in his great book on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, he does acknowledge the value of a certain kind of playfulness with words. Aristotle famously argues that happiness follows from virtuous activity, and that the virtues depend on having the habit of finding the mean between two extremes. To have the virtue of courage, for example, one should neither be cowardly nor reckless. He also writes about a less obvious virtue, in Greek, eutrapelia, which can be translated as clever wit. Between the extremes of buffoonery, don't be a clown, and the extreme of humorlessness, don't be boring. Aristotle writes this, "Those who are beyond propriety in matters of humor are thought to be buffoons or vulgar, eager to be humorous by any means and aiming at causing laughter, rather than saying what is proper or causing no pain to the one laughed at. Others, having nothing humorous to say and being displeased with those who do, are thought to be boorish or obtuse. Those who amuse others in a proper manner, on the other hand, are given the name witty or eutrapelia." Aristotle's idea is that social life is better when people can joke in the proper fashion. I'm going to get to the importance of playfulness ultimately for Shakespeare, but let me continue with the philosophers a little. The Christian Thomas Aquinas, who loved the pagan Aristotle, uses that same word eutrapelia to make a similar argument as Aristotle had made. But Aquinas goes further, to the point of redefining the word and speaking about a slightly different virtue. He speaks of something that's not just socially useful and something that's not just a trait of the clever and educated aristocrat, something broader, something that everybody can possess. He begins by noting that work means weariness. And just as laborers need bodily relaxation, so too, writes Aquinas, do those engaged in intellectual work need rest for their souls. Quote, one man is more soul-wearied than another, according as he is more intensely occupied with works of reason. Now, just as weariness of the body is dispelled by resting the body, so weariness of the soul must needs be remedied by resting the soul. And the soul's rest is pleasure. Now, such like words or deeds wherein nothing further is sought than the soul's pleasure are called playful or humorous. In speaking of it as the soul's pleasure, he intimates a higher notion of play than had previously been articulated in the philosophic tradition or in Christian theology. For Aquinas, play is a real good in itself, a proper end for the soul, especially for those who seek after wisdom. The latter point Aquinas stresses when he compares the pursuit of wisdom to play. Quote, first, play gives pleasure, and in the contemplation of wisdom, there is the most profound pleasure. Secondly, the activity of play is not directed towards some other end, but is sought for its own sake. And this also holds true in regard to the pleasures arising from the contemplation of wisdom. Hence, even eternal wisdom likens its joy to that of play. I was daily his delight, always making play before him. Aquinas is there quoting from the book of Proverbs. He's redefining eutrapelia as something more than the clever wit that Aristotle praises, but more something like mirth, merriment, light-hearted playfulness, which is necessary for the health of the soul. 2 centuries later, and 2 generations before the birth of Shakespeare, the English statesman Thomas More quoted Aquinas on eutrapelia, and More also celebrated ancient writers, Lucian and Democritus, the laughing philosopher, as Democritus was called, who both took playful things seriously and serious things playfully. I suspect that Shakespeare knows this tradition of taking play seriously through his reading of Thomas More. And it seems to me that a good way to read Shakespeare's comedies is to see their author as himself a laughing philosopher. Some of his plays do offer warnings against the wrong kind of laughter, laughter based on cruelty, and the wrong kind of play. I'm especially thinking of 2 plays, Love's Labour's Lost, if you know that one, in which the cleverness proves sterile and egoistic, and Twelfth Night with the torture of a character, Malvolio, where the fun is clearly turning vicious. But Shakespeare, the playwright, is not a killjoy, and he wants you to laugh at the right things, and he wants you to play in the right way. In a number of comedies, he shows how the right kind of play can be a way of escaping from unhappiness and making things end well. Indeed, 2 of his comedies, The Merchant of Venice and As You Like It, have a similar plot structure in which, after an opening scene in which unhappy men talk about being unhappy and remain unhappy, an unhappy heroine in the second scene is scolded by her female friend for indulging in unhappiness. Don't be unhappy. It's bad to be unhappy. It's good to be happy. Nerissa tells Portia to get over herself, that her situation isn't so bad. Celia tells Rosalind, be merry. Portia and Rosalind then follow that advice. They choose to be merry, and they do so immediately by deciding to play a game. In doing so, in choosing to be merry, in choosing to play, they set these comedies now on the comic trajectory towards the happy ending. The happy ending is the result of the choice to play. Moreover, Portia and Rosalind later play a game with the obtuse men who are in love with them to teach them. These young men need teaching. In this case, these young men need teaching specifically about marriage, and the women who are going to marry them need to teach them a thing or two firsthand. I'm not going to offer detailed readings of plays, but I'll quickly note that Shakespeare has male characters too. The outrageous Petruchio in The Taming of the Shrew, and the silly old man Gonzalo in The Tempest, who may be best understood as playful teachers. For Shakespeare, as for Plato, play can be a means of education, a way of turning from the misery of ignorance to the happiness of understanding. I have been celebrating the rigorous play that Shakespeare and Johnson experienced in their schooling and that the philosophers speak of, because it undoubtedly creates minds that are sharp and can also lead to lives that are joyful and full of wonder. Let me celebrate, too, the Founders Academies, because in your graduates, the dozen or so that I've taught at the University of Dallas, I have seen that playfulness and joy and sense of wonder, and I'm happy that they're in my classroom. The kind of classical education that you are offering is especially valuable today, when academic standards have become very low, and maybe more so, when so many children are without the playful spirit that should come naturally at their age. This may seem an odd thought, but a good education should make one more playful. An education in the great books, ideas, works, and deeds of the Western tradition can and should be fun, can make one more fun, can develop in one a lighter heart. When we are playful, we tend to be at our happiest. And I am claiming that a classical education not only gives one a sharper intellect and a knowledge of this, that, and the other thing, but that it may also be a spur to play. And right now, in our anxious age, that is especially important. To speak about a sensitive subject, a subject which most of us have first or secondhand experience of, many young Americans are anxious, even suffering from anxiety disorders, in a way that has no precedent in previous generations. There are a number of causes, including different parenting techniques, as children in the last 35 years have been watched over more and given less freedom to explore than in earlier periods, which may have made them less confident and resilient. But it is since 2012, just 9 years ago, that the number of students with anxiety disorders has skyrocketed, which period corresponds pretty tightly to the widespread use of the smartphone. I don't have time to get into this, but it may not just be the content of social media, but even too the addictive nature of the smartphone that's causing harm. Whatever the causes, the statistics indicate a growing problem. And teachers in the United States and elsewhere have anecdotes, many anecdotes, about more students struggling with their studies because of personal problems. The good news, the reason for hope for anyone who is struggling with anxiety, is that this is a condition that can definitely be overcome, including through counseling, especially through some version of cognitive behavioral therapy. But here's an anecdote to point to another way of moving from anxiety to playful happiness. At the University of Dallas in the last few years, we've been dealing with the same problem that I'm sure you're dealing with, that every grammar school, high school, college, and university has been dealing with. A few years ago, I started noticing that my freshmen would walk into a classroom and, unlike past students, would sit quietly, often looking glum, often staring at their phones with a dull expression on their faces. Until I finally banned phones, not just during class, but once somebody walked through the door, I said, phone has to be, I see no phones in my room, even before class starts. As we would read Homer's Odyssey and Dante's Divine Comedy, however, I saw the character of the classroom change, opening up, lightening up, friendships getting made over conversations about Odysseus's daring or the pilgrim Dante's struggles and joys. And then when I entered the room for my senior class, I was, as always, greeted by 110 decibels of laughter and friends swapping stories and teasing each other and being goofy before they engaged in conversations about the literature that were as insightful as they'd ever been. I saw that the education over 4 years was still doing its magic, inclining the students to thoughtfulness and playfulness and joy. Let me end by suggesting that the thoughtfulness, playfulness, and joy are essential too for you, the teachers. The life of the teacher in the 21st century is increasingly a battle. And it's not some ancient or medieval battle fought on a single morning, but the battle of the Somme or Gallipoli or Verdun or some other example of trench warfare from World War I, day after day, month after month, right? Ours is a tough profession. It can sap one's energy, especially as the bureaucratization of American life over the last half-century has hit our profession hard. Just more and more work has been put on everybody's shoulders. But if we are to help lead our students to a joyful fulfillment of their humanity, we ourselves need to be as fully human as possible, not just automatons cranking out lesson plans and marking up homework, as much as these things need to be done. If one agrees with the 20th century Dutch thinker, Johann Huizinga, fundamental to our humanity is play. Huizinga argues that we should be classified as not Homo sapiens, but Homo ludens, playing man, or man the player, the human being as player. Note in the following passage from his book entitled Homo Ludens, the connection between play and mind and freedom, these most essential aspects of our humanity. Quote, "But in acknowledging play, you acknowledge mind. For whatever else play is, it is not matter. Even in the animal world, it bursts the bounds of the physically existent. From the point of view of a world wholly determined by the operation of blind forces, play would be altogether superfluous. Play only becomes possible, thinkable, and understandable when an influx of mind breaks down the absolute determinism of the cosmos." And Huizinga continues, "First and foremost, then, all play is a voluntary activity. Play to order is no longer play. It could at best be but a forcible imitation of it. By this quality of freedom alone, play marks itself off from the course of the natural process. The successful education of a student, the student's becoming the best and happiest he or she can be, is dependent upon a host of factors, most especially one beyond our control, the family. And in the classroom, the curriculum is obviously important. Still, for there to be discipulus ludens, the playing student, there must be magister ludens. I don't mean that you, the playing teacher, should keep in the classroom floppy shoes and a red fright wig. No. As we heard, Aristotle wrote, "Don't be a buffoon." No. Instead, consider again Johnson's tribute to his teacher, Camden. What faith thou hast in things! What sight in searching the most antique springs! Camden's searching, his own intellectual interests, and the joy and vitality they imparted to him, he shared with his students. The lively Camden helped make the lively Johnson. A teacher's own faith in things, own interest, own forms of play are a necessary source of joy and vitality. Because of the demands on our time, we make sacrifices, inevitably so, such as giving up reading for pleasure or the hobbies that we love or time with friends. But the loss of our own play makes us wearier. Our vitality and our success in the classroom require that we bring to the classroom an influx of mind and a sense of our own freedom. Your playful joy is necessary for your students' playful joy. And that begins a virtuous cycle, as we can then behold their joy in learning, and from that gain energy and be more joyful ourselves, and thus want to play all the more. Thank you. And I believe there's a little bit of time for questions and thoughts.
Thank you for that talk. I truly love that. One of the things that I see a lot in young people nowadays is humor has devolved to ironic detachment or nihilistic absurdity. Where is the place of classical satire in a classical classroom? Sorry for the redundancy. Like Aristophanes, the classical satirist, is he a cruel buffoon? I've had a theology professor refer to him as thus, or is he something higher or more elevated? Where does that classical satirical writing that we see when he talks about what love is like in the symposium, what's the place for that in the classroom? Or is that something that this generation isn't ready to embrace when it comes to playfulness and witticism?
Good question. Very good question. I'm reminded about this matter of that ours is an age of ironic detachment. What immediate thought was, after the great tragedy of the last couple of decades, the September 11th attacks, right? Who could make a joke, right? A couple of weeks later, The Onion, that online parody newspaper, The Onion finally issued had their new issue. What do you do after this, right? And they made jokes about how people are trying to be ironically detached, and somehow it doesn't work, right? Of course, we've slipped back into ironic detachment. It seems so easy for us now. But obviously, in the face of tragedy, ironic detachment's maybe not the best thing, and it's certainly not what we want for children, right? You want sweetness from children. Back to what I was saying before, that we have limited effect, right? The family is more influential than we are. And this is not to say that teachers can't then help overcome problems in the family, right? It seems to me, though, that initial joy has to come before they come into the classroom, but then we can do things with it. I don't. By the way, I'm just kind of babbling now because I don't have an intelligent answer to your question. I think, well, maybe just two quick thoughts. First, you mentioned Aristophanes and classical satire. I love Aristophanes. I would not teach Aristophanes to high school kids, and certainly not to anybody younger than that. I love teaching Aristophanes to sophomores. Actually, there are a couple of people in this room who have actually studied Aristophanes with me when they were sophomores. Aristophanes is this, I think you'd call him like the 4th century BC version of South Park. Of a really nasty, crude, vindictive, like as mean-spirited as possible comedy, but that's actually very high. That's intellectually ambitious. That Aristophanes is actually really smart, and South Park can be kind of smart sometimes, but nasty. Like, don't notice. You don't want Aristophanes with your here at Founders. But yeah, that kind of sharp comedy, when you're older, when you know how to balance that, right? When your disposition is maybe a little more settled. For young people, you want sweetness, you want silliness. And maybe this is one thought, that as we are facing so many young people who seem to be kind of world weary before they should be, right? A 14-year-old shouldn't be world weary yet, should he? Should she? Maybe one's own lightheartedness is the best way to counteract that. And so back to how I was ending with this necessity, as hard as our jobs are, and as much as, yeah, the responsibilities are such that we are overworked and overtired and this and that, right? That we do have to cultivate the sources of our own joy, because that joyful spirit brought into the classroom can help, help turn those people who are too bitter at too young an age, right? There is something lovely about being around joyful people, right? It's just, it's infectious in the right way, and that seems to be maybe the best way of dealing with students who too young have too much of an ironic detachment about things.
Hello, is this on? Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was incredible. Sometimes classical education has a bad rap of being too stuffy, I think.
Sometimes what does?
Classical education, the resurgence of classical education gets the reputation of being too stuffy. And I hope that's wrong in the founder schools, because a classroom without a joke can be a very dry place. And so thanks for backing that up with Shakespeare at Alia. I have two questions I'd like to get your reaction to. If you carry what you're saying into the 18th century, two big names, or really three, would be Joseph Addison in The Spectator, and then in his plays, and then Samuel Johnson as well. And that gets carried into America via Ben Franklin. So I'm wondering, in answer to his question, Franklin's quips, he learns to write via The Spectator. And in fact, there were a couple of Dallas professors, I don't know if you were one, a few years back, that wrote a volume on how to learn to write by imitating.
That's the guy who's going to be talking to you tomorrow, by the way. My best friend on campus, a guy named Dr. Greg Roper, will be talking to you tomorrow.
That's great. So what about imitating Franklin-esque aphorisms? And because those writing assignments that you were giving at the very beginning, I think for a practical application would be very helpful if it could be done in this classical way that we're talking about. And it would, if you're dealing with Franklin or somebody like that, it brings in a lot of humor. And it wouldn't necessarily be this detached, meme stuff that we see nowadays. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And then I have a little bit tougher question. It's one that I've wrestled with a little bit. Though it's hard, I do see humor sometimes in Socratic dialogues. In reading the Gospels, do you find some humor on the part of Jesus? Or is that too tough one to deal with?
That's a very tough one. I'm not a theologian. Sometimes I'll pretend to be at a party, but no. Again, mentioning something which I'm not sure I want to recommend. So just to the second question, one of the most bizarre movies I've ever seen was made by the Spanish surrealist Luis Buñuel, who was friends with Picasso and was a noted, atheist, Marxist, etc. So I think his most famous movie is like this 1970s French movie called The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie or whatever. Weirdly enough, in the late 1960s, Luis Buñuel made a movie called The Milky Way, and it's just so bizarre, and I'm not sure I want to recommend it because there are parts of it like, that is bizarre, and like one part that's a bit pornographic even. But it's this odd movie where it's these two tramps in contemporary France walking the pilgrimage route down to Spain, to the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage route. And along the way, they meet people, and all these people are famous heretics of the past. We're transported in time. And there's this one scene where these Gnostics from the 5th century are having, the one that said was pornographic, they're having an orgy. But then there's, in the 17th century, these two French cavaliers, and they're having a sword fight, and they're insulting each other. And you realize one is a Jesuit and one is a Jansenist. Just bizarre. But the movie is interspersed throughout with scenes of Christ with his apostles. And it's all these passages, which one hears, one's whole life, or, one reads in the Bible all the time. And it's the most remarkably attractive picture of Christ I've ever seen on film, because Christ is funny. It's these lines you've heard from the Gospels, and you realize, like, not funny like clownish funny, but just like the warm, friendly friend whose intelligence actually has some wit to it. And the apostles he's so attractive to the apostles because he's charming, he's interesting, he's funny. This movie, all Boone-Wells' atheist friends were aghast at. They thought he was converting to Christianity. What is he doing, giving us the most attractive presentation of Christ? No, he was still an atheist. I don't know what was going on. Anyway, that's the only thing I can say about that second question. I have no idea. I'm no scripture scholar. About the first one, I think that's a really good thing. One of the things I love teaching great writers, including great writers whose own sense of humor students can see, like a Ben Franklin with that wonderful wit of his. One of the things I love to do in teaching great literature is to make students realize, like, if you're not laughing, you're not doing it right. You're not reading well if you're not picking up the jokes. I think young people, this is just in any generation, young people are going to have this, I think, an inclination that, oh, schoolwork, everything must be serious, there can be no fun, right? Our fun is in the playground. Schoolwork can't be fun, and great authors, classical authors, they must be serious and uptight, right? And, tragedy, Hamlet, is really funny, right? Hamlet's always cracking jokes, right? It's funny. Anyhow, to get students to realize that these most attractive works of literature, right, they're often really funny, and to call attention to the humor sometimes as a way for students to see that an education of reading the greatest things that have been written is an education where actually you're finding the greatest minds are often also typically the most humorous minds. So if that's an answer to your first question. Any others?
Would you think culture would take place in the understanding of why some do not find the humor in some of the pieces, whether modern or classical?
Sure. I think it is, as I said before, one, maybe just a function of age. When you're young, young people often just, miss out on humor sometimes. I think we do, though, often communicate to them this idea of this kind of split that, responsibility and virtue is all about being uptight. And if you're having fun, there must be something wrong with you. Sometimes that cultural message is being imparted. Sometimes it's imparted like, yeah, be vicious and have fun, right? No, don't be vicious. I think it's really valuable for teachers to communicate to their students that, yeah, be virtuous. Yeah, live a good life. And do so by enjoying yourself and creating that culture where people see that these things actually do come together. Any life is full of sorrow, right? Any life is full of hard work that beats you down, right? It's not that life is playtime, and there's that opposite problem, right? Of treating, the classroom and all of life is just playtime. No, you got to get, right? You need your rigor, you need your seriousness. But I love how these philosophers I was quoting and people like Johnson and Shakespeare are giving us this ideal of the right kind of playfulness with the right kind of seriousness. And it seems to me that a university, a grammar school, a high school that can create an academic culture where students can see that these kind of things can come together well is doing a great job.
Hello. Oftentimes in reading Shakespeare, students pick up on what they think is innuendo or what sometimes actually is innuendo. Mm-hmm. And it can get really awkward. How do you acknowledge the intellectual act of spotting something that is or appears to be that, while not allowing the class to kind of derail into one, maybe the too much of a celebration of finding this kind of thing, and then two, always looking for this in the future?
Yeah. Yeah, you don't want somebody to take things and drag them through the gutter. Before what I was saying about I'm never going to teach Aristophanes to anybody younger than sophomore age college, and sometimes I've wondered how well that's working. There's this question of prudence, right? Things being age appropriate. With Shakespeare in particular, coming from that culture which did kind of engage in bawdiness more than we're used to. By the way, I've read, because of my work I do, that I know Shakespeare's contemporaries very well. Shakespeare's actually much more chaste than his contemporaries. Shakespeare his sense of humor is much more genial, and it's much less vulgar than pretty much any other writer of the late 16th, early 17th century. That said, Shakespeare does occasionally have bawdy humor. I've done some teaching of Shakespeare to high school students, and never taught junior highs. I've never taught Shakespeare to people that young. Not call attention to things, certainly, where the innuendo is really vulgar. I'm trying to think if I've had times when students have pointed it out and just had to deal with it. I've had that with college kids. I've just simply not had that experience of students commenting, younger students commenting on innuendo. How I would react, I don't know. Those are always the kind of the prudence of the moment. You don't want to seem like you're censoring the work. So there has to be kind of an acknowledgement. And yet, then, you don't want to dwell on it. Especially with a Shakespeare play, there's 100,000 things to talk about, right? The plays are just so dense, so rich. And so it can just kind of turn the conversation to something else. I think it's, please.
I'll try to keep this quick. As a child of the original Star Wars generation, your figure of speech reference with Yoda just made me smile inside. And it made me remember all of my childhood days of pig Latin and the joys of spoonerisms and all those different figures of speech. And could you elaborate any more on incorporating those into a classroom environment? I mean, I can initially think of them as memory devices, because when something is unique, it's easier to remember. But can you think of any other ways that we could intentionally incorporate those fun figures of speech into the classroom environment in a positive way?
Sure. One of the things that I think is so promising about what's happening in schools like Founders and other classical academies is this recognition that the turn over the last 50, 60 years in American education, while there may be some good things that have been acquired, a lot of great things have been lost, and most especially in education and poetry. People used to have to memorize poems all the time. My grandma grew up in the 1910s in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Massachusetts, right? This kind of stereotypical one-room country schoolhouse. She had to memorize a poem a week her whole life. And it did great things for her, right? It gave her a facility with language. It helped her develop a stronger memory. And so I just love the idea of students at a young age just hearing poetry, not to analyze it. Older kids, they can learn to analyze poetry. But hearing poetry just to love the sound of it, right? And the basic sentiments and basic images. I think that's great to do. And then once you have kids get some poetry under their belt, that it's not this kind of foreign, horrible thing. What is this thing? A poem? What am I touching here? Oh, I need to go wipe my hands, right? No. It's just something that becomes natural. You're memorizing poems all the time. You're hearing poems. It's just something that's part of your education. It seems to me that once you have the students with that kind of comfort with poetry, then you're in the position that you can then kind of have more fun with it. And have them do playful exercises. You brought up spoonerisms, and there are all these kind of comic forms of poetry, right? We think of the sonnet and more serious. Actually, sonnets sometimes can be fun too, but more serious forms. They're kind of comic forms of poetry. And have children write silly verse. It's fun to write silly verse, right? Especially, everybody grows up with Dr. Seuss these days, right? People know that silly verse is fun. And by giving them those kind of exercises, then even having, hey, you need to have a simile in your clery-hue. A clery-hue, by the way, is when you have a poem about a person where you have to have lines that rhyme with the person's name. So one is Sir Humphrey Davy discovered, oh shoot, now I can't remember it. Humphrey Davies, oh shoot, I've forgotten this one. Dang it. It's where, anyhow, it's this kind of form of poetry where you have the lines end with rhymes of the person's last name. Anyhow, you do that and then say, okay, have a simile in there. Or then have anastrophe, right? The Yoda figure, as everybody calls it now, right? And get them used to seeing that, oh, you can have fun with language. You can even pay a particular attention to language, and it's not some kind of beatdown, right? This is a neat thing to do. I think that's very possible. And I'm very heartened by the recognition that we're regaining, that poetry should just be something that students find fun, and that they should love having great poems in their heads. Yeah, I mean, later on they can analyze it in deep ways, but when they're young, just let them enjoy it and have fun with it. Hey, good. It's 3:05, so I think I've taken up more than my time. Again, congratulations on the excellent work you're doing here, and thank you for your time.